Firstly, thank you for Turner Pope for inviting me this evening to present Immupharma. It's always a pleasure to tell the story, and looking around the room, I can see a few familiar faces, so welcome to you. You've heard the story before, and I'll try and update it for you. But it's more of a pleasure to be able to introduce the story to those people that haven't heard it before. So thank you very much to Ben and James and the rest of the team. The presentation will take about 15-20 minutes, and then I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. So without further ado, let's get started. So the management team, myself as non-executive chairman, my background is very much financial. I do try and explain science to non-scientists. I'll try my best this evening. I'm joined this evening also by our CEO, Dimitri, who's just there, just in the second row, and somewhere at the back, Lisa Badaroun, our head of investor communications, who does all the clever stuff behind all these presentations. I'm not going to take you through the rest of the team, but needless to say, they're all very experienced in the industry, and it's a very, very experienced team right across. So let me introduce the company to you. We are what we call a pharmaceutical development company, so we develop drugs, quite different to Venture Life and what Jerry was explaining to you earlier on. And we've been on AIM since about 2006, so about 12 years now. And what everybody knows us for is our lead drug, which is a drug called Lupusor for the treatment of lupus. And I will try and explain to you in as simple terms as I can what it does, what lupus is, and also how Lupusor works to treat that disease. It's currently in a phase 3 pivotal study. So for those of you who are not quite familiar with the clinical development process, we go through a very highly regulated system of clinical studies which escalate through phase 1, 2 and 3 as they're called, and phase 3 is the final part of that clinical development process, which is where Lupusor is. And I'm sure most of you are aware, or I'm making an assumption most of you are aware, that we are at quite a pivotal stage of that study now, and the guidance that we've been giving quite consistently and we're sticking to is that the results, the top line results from that study should be out before the end of this quarter one, so around the end of this quarter. We call it blockbuster potential, and what do we mean by blockbuster? Well, in the industry, when we talk about that, we talk about a drug which has the potential to sell in excess of $1 billion per year. That's an awful lot of money, but that's the sort of money that we talk about in the pharmaceutical industry, and this certainly has the potential to achieve that level, both in terms of its product profile, but also the patient population it's going in, pricing, and unfortunately for patients, the lack of any available treatments or suitable treatments, effective treatments on the market already. We call the platform from which this emanates from, this drug, P140 platform, and that's important because there's not only this one drug, well it is a drug, I should say, but it's not only there to treat lupus, which is what we're trying it for now, but it has the potential to treat all other autoimmune diseases. And I will go on to explain this background of autoimmune because lupus is an autoimmune disease, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail. But there are other autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, thyroid, very many well-known diseases which are all derived from an autoimmune response. And if we can prove the theory that we have the Lupusor in lupus, then we have a very, very good opportunity to expand the indications of this drug across quite a number of different fields. So obviously from a commercial point of view, that's very important. We do have other drugs in the portfolio. Everyone either ignores those or they're not aware of them because they're slightly early in development, so at the phase 1, phase 2 level. They are very exciting in their own rights, but I do understand that all the focus from the investment community certainly is on Lupusor and the trial which we're about to announce. So I'm not going to spend any time, for obvious reasons tonight, talking about the other programs, but needless to say, we are as excited about those, albeit in early stage development, as we are about Lupusor. The company originated, and the IP originated from a long-standing collaboration which we have with a research organisation called the CNRS, and my French isn't good enough to pronounce the whole of it, so I won't even bother. The CNRS, which is the largest organisation of its kind in Europe, So it's based in France, funded entirely by the French government, and has some fantastic scientists and researchers working for it. We have a really close collaboration where Lupusor has originated from, and actually all the rest of IP in our portfolio. And that's a really important collaboration, because what it means is that not only are we getting great opportunities out of that research, but we're not paying for the research. So we're just applying investors' money to applied development, clinical development, which saves an awful lot of time, effort, and money. I mentioned the management team. Needless to say, we are all very experienced in this business, and we operate what is the norm in this business now, a virtual model or an outsourcing model, so keeping the overheads very low. So just in terms of the market, you will be aware, and James mentioned it just earlier, that we've just completed a £10 million fundraising, which was placed and organised by Turner Pope Investments, so thank you very much, guys. But we've done a little bit of fundraising over the last 2 or 3 years, primarily to fund the phase 3 study and some further work in the earlier portfolio. And I'm pleased to say that at each stage we have raised money at ever-increasing prices. So when I first joined the company about 3 years ago, we did a fundraising to fund the phase 3 study, and we raised that at 26 pence. And then every fundraising since then, including the last one, has been at escalating prices, and the last fundraise was done at £1.44. So we're currently trading around £1.33 with a market cap of about just under 200 million, just to put it in context. This is the overview of the pipeline, which, as I say, I'm not going to spend any time on, but the other areas just out of interest for you, we've got a program in oncology, we've also got programs in diabetes and eye diseases, or diseases of the eye, I should say. So let me try and explain what lupus is. A number of you will be familiar with lupus, because I know from my own interactions with you that you either know somebody who's got lupus, or unfortunately maybe one of your loved ones has got lupus. And it's a very debilitating disease. It's what we do call an autoimmune disease, and I was explaining earlier about some of the other autoimmune diseases that one can contract. And what happens, the immune system is effectively turning in on itself, and the body believes that it's under attack from an outside pathogen or a virus or something, in very much the same way that when you think of a vaccine response, when you take a vaccine, the body's immune system believes it's under attack. In that case, it is, by a tiny amount of the drug which you're taking as the vaccine. And in that case, it produces antibodies, which give you your protection against whichever disease you're trying to vaccinate against. With an autoimmune disease, the body mistakenly believes that it's under attack, and it falls within itself, if I can use that phrase. But instead of producing antibodies, it produces what we call autoantibodies. It's these autoantibodies which do the damage. And depending on how you present, you'll present, in the case of lupus, with a multisymptomatic disease. If it's thyroid, obviously you get problems with your thyroid. If it's multiple sclerosis, for example, it will damage your nerve endings. And each patient will present slightly differently. But the origins of the disease, and this goes to the heart of how Lupusor works, the origins of the disease is an autoimmune response from the immune system of your body. So in lupus, I just mentioned a multisymptomatic disease. So patients who are generally women and non-Caucasian women, so 85% roughly of the population of lupus sufferers will be women, and as I say, the main majority will be non-Caucasian. So they present with many, many symptoms, and not all patients present with the same symptoms, but they range from quite a nasty skin rash, which presents on the face and the body, with fever, with fatigue, with damage to some of the organs. And this is why it has, in the past certainly, been a very difficult disease to diagnose, because patients will go to the doctors with joint pains. Generally, that's one of the first signs. And so they'll go through the whole rigmarole of, well, do you have rheumatoid arthritis, or do you have something else? And so it has been a very difficult disease to diagnose. It is getting better because of knowledge of doctors and patients, and the patient advocacy groups, which are helping tremendously in raising the disease to everyone's attention. On the commercial side, the potential, as I mentioned earlier, is multi-billion. And so how do I get to those numbers? Well, the number of sufferers worldwide is about 5 million. And if we look at it in commercial terms and we talk about the major markets, pharmaceutical markets, then we're talking about the States, Europe and the Far East, primarily Japan. And within those territories there are about 1.5 million patients. So with some of the diseases which you may be familiar with in the pharmaceutical industry, it's not an awful lot of patients, but when you look at it in commercial terms, we expect that this drug will be a high revenue generator in the sense that it will sell probably for somewhere around $20,000 to $25,000 per patient per year. And that pricing is based on the only other drug which has been approved for lupus in the last 50 years, which is a drug called Benlysta, launched by GlaxoSmithKline, which I will come back to do a comparison for you because they're two completely different drugs. But that drug sells for around $25,000 per year, and it's generating about 500 million per year at the moment. Hasn't quite reached its potential yet, or the accelerated revenues which GSK were expecting. But if you do simple maths, and you're pricing a drug anywhere around $20,000 to $25,000 per year, you only need 50,000 patients out of that 1.5 million accessible to get to your billion-dollar blockbuster status. And we believe with the profile of Lupusor, its superior efficacy and absolutely benign safety profile, that it will be very attractive to both patients and rheumatologists or the specialists that prescribe this for this particular disease. So in terms of Lupusor, I'm trying to explain to you how it works. When I talk, I think we do have a slide, the next one, so I'm going to flick between the two, if I can get this to work. I will come back to the novel mechanism on the next slide, but I think it's also important to raise your attention to a few other advantages which we have, and those are mostly regulatory. The trial that we're currently running is under the auspices of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA in the United States. And as you know, they're very strict on allowing drugs through the regulatory process. And they've seen all the data on Lupusor to date, and we've got two very special commitments from the FDA, if I can call it that. One is called a special protocol assessment, which means that we have agreed the protocol with the FDA, and providing that we deliver according to that protocol and the clinical endpoints which we've agreed, then they will have no reason to change their mind or to block the approval of this drug. And the second advantage we have is in the regulatory process itself, the approval process. We have what's called fast-track approval, and that means that when the file goes in for approval, they have to turn it around in 6 months versus a pretty undefined time frame for most other drugs. I will come on to it, but it's worth saying it now as we're talking about FDA. This study is 200 patients, and that's only 200 patients, I emphasize that. For a phase 3 trial, you'd normally expect thousands of patients. And the reason for that is we agreed with the FDA these numbers, and they are perfectly comfortable with the safety profile of Lupusor. In other words, they have the same confidence that we do that it's got a completely benign safety profile. Otherwise, they would ask for lots more patients in the study to see whether we got any of those remote statistical instances of safety or side effects. And we are confident that we can show statistical significance in terms of the profile of this drug with 200 patients. I think that's an important point to say, both in terms of what our expectations are, but also the approach of the FDA. So a validation in very strong terms in 2 or 3 different ways from the FDA. So let me try and explain in a non-scientific way how this works. And I'm a non-scientist, so I have to do this, I'm afraid. We're talking about the immune system, and the immune system is not something that you can go into a doctor's office and see a diagram on the wall, a little bit like these murals on the wall here. You're all used to going into a doctor's office and seeing a skeletal system or the nervous system. You can't really very easily draw the immune system because it's really just a collection of cells all around your body, and different types of cells that we call T cells and B cells, and these all have a purpose within the immune system. And so if you can imagine what we call a cascade, and I mentioned to you earlier on about being vaccinated against certain diseases. So if you can imagine that cascade, in other words, when you're vaccinated with a tiny piece of the disease you're trying to protect against, what that does is start to create a response from the immune system, and that response essentially is to send signals all the way through the immune system in what we call a cascade. And as we've shown here on this diagram, it comes out with these autoantibodies, which are the damaging response to patients suffering from an autoimmune disease. On the right, what you have with our P140 platform, or Lupusor, the drug in particular, is we are still administering it in the same way. So it's what we call a subcutaneous injection, so you'll be used to this with your vaccine. The doctor or the nurse will just give you a quick prick in the top of the arm. You don't really feel it, hopefully, and that's it, done. And that actually then starts that cascade that I talked about in the immune system. With ourselves, what we're trying to do with people suffering from autoimmune diseases is to essentially turn off that cascade before it even starts. So this is why we're putting this X here at the top of the cascade. Because if you can stop the cascade starting in the first place, you don't have any ill effects in the immune system. You don't get the production of the autoantibodies. You also keep the immune system completely free, so it continues to operate even when you're taking Lupusor. It continues to operate fully and giving you full immunization against everything that's supposed to do. And that's the key to how Lupusor works. It's what we call modulates the immune system. It doesn't try and block it. And this, unfortunately, has been the demise of many other drugs in development for lupus over the last 5 to 10 years. Most of the major pharma companies have had a drug in development for lupus. They've all failed, with the one exception of GSK's Benlysta. And the difference that we have to all of those other approaches is if you can imagine trying to interfere with the immune system. I don't know why I'm pointing here, because you can't see what I'm pointing at, but you can see up there. But at the level of T cell and B cell, what they were trying to do is use all different types of pharmaceutical agents to try and block those cells from operating. And they were unsuccessful because there are literally millions of these cells all over your body. So to try and target every single one of those cells and block them is impossible. And if you leave only some of them free to work, then you're not stopping the progression of the disease. It will get through and it will produce autoantibodies. And the other problem with that approach is when you are restricting the way the immune system works, then you are depleting the body of that protection. If you compromise the immune system in any way, and you'll probably be familiar with this with oncology, with cancer patients who are immunocompromised, they are exposed to all sorts of problems. So the approach that all other companies have tried before have had those two bigger disadvantages. One, it's not effective because you can't block all of the cells in the cascade. And secondly, it does give rise to some pretty major side effects because you compromise the immune system. So Lupusor's main advantage, and what people try to understand about the difference we have in approach, is that we're not trying to block the immune system, we're modulating it. And we're stopping that cascade working right from the beginning. And that's the difference, that's the big trick. So to try and illustrate the difference, we have a slide here comparing Lupusor's phase 2 results with Benlysta's phase 3 results. And I do emphasize that because there are a number of differences here. Firstly, we have in our phase 3 study, we only studied for 3 months. In Benlysta's phase 3 study, as we are in our current phase 3, they expose the patients to 12 months. So you'd expect a better response over 12 months than you would over 3. But if you look at the data which is presented here, we are far superior in efficacy and response rate, as we call it, from Benlysta. So the red in the middle of the slide here, 62% versus 43, far, far superior, with an absolutely benign safety profile. And I mean absolutely benign, so no side effects whatsoever, which I'm standing here and I've been in this industry now almost 30 years, and I've been involved in a lot of clinical studies with different companies, and I've never seen a product profile with no side effects. But that is the way that the drug works, in the way that I've just explained to you. There is actually nothing in the bloodstream. There is nothing to elicit a side effect because we're not restricting the immune system. And that has been supported all the way through all of our studies, our preclinical studies and all the clinical studies to date. And I mentioned earlier about the approach of the FDA. The FDA are perfectly comfortable with the safety profile of Lupusor. That's a major advantage that we have. So you can take, without me going through every single statistic on this slide, you can see that we are far superior in efficacy, or the way the drug works, to Benlysta. Benlysta is the only other drug on the marketplace for this disease. It's what we call in the industry a highly unmet medical need. So if we're successful, and we're pretty confident of the success of this trial, if we're confident and it gets through, this will be a blockbuster many times over for all the reasons I've said, both the product profile, but also the commercial potential, the pricing, the access to patients. That's what makes us very confident about this being a very good success. Actually, I think I've covered this slide in terms of the pricing, and the reference price that I was using was Benlysta's price, which is selling around $25,000 to $30,000 a year. So my simple maths, if we were to sell it at $20,000 per year, every 50,000 patients, which is not a big market penetration in 1.5 million, you're getting $1 billion. There are other advantages we have over Benlysta as well. They are two completely different types of drugs. Our drug is what's called a peptide. It's a series of amino acids, very, very easy to manufacture, very, very inexpensive to manufacture, and we use tiny amounts of the drug. So whatever this drug is sold for, we will get a very, very high margin. So we will get a 96% plus margin on whatever pricing this drug goes out at. In contrast, Benlysta is what's called a monoclonal antibodies. You'll probably be familiar with those that actually are very effective in many other diseases and a great innovation. Unfortunately, they're very, very difficult to manufacture, very expensive to manufacture. And in the case of Benlysta, the patients have to go in to see their doctor and they have to be administered with a vein in the arm, a little bit like kidney dialysis. So they're sat in the doctor's or the hospital for about 3 or 4 hours at a time, and it's very time consuming and actually not very patient friendly. So you can see we're starting to build up an awful lot of advantages over Benlysta. So we're asked very often how we're going to get this drug to market. You may be aware that the company did have a licensing deal a few years ago with a US company called Cephalon, which is a very, very successful deal and one of the most successful and lucrative deals of its kind, totaling 500 million in milestones and double-digit royalties. And in fact, the company received $45 million under that deal, and everything was going fine. And then Cephalon unfortunately got taken over by an Israeli company called Teva, who certainly at that point were very much a generics company and had no interest in developing pharmaceutical drugs or branded patented drugs, I should say. So Immupharma, before I joined the company, took the opportunity to take the drug back, and that's why we're taking it all the way through. So we're in a very unusual position of having a drug this close to market, which we own 100% of. So the next question is, well, how are we going to get it to market? Well, an obvious route is to do another deal with a major pharmaceutical company. And I'm not telling anything that I haven't said before, that there is a lot of interest in this drug. We are under discussions with an awful lot of companies on this, as you would imagine, with a potential blockbuster as it is. But there are other ways to get this drug to market. With the advantages it has, the ease of manufacture, it's a specialist type drug, so you don't need to have a massive sales force to sell this across different territories. We could consider doing regional type deals and maybe selling direct in some territories ourselves. I'm not saying that's the way we're going to go, but it is an option. So there's more than one way to crack this nut in terms of getting this product to market. And I'm sure you haven't escaped the last bullet point there. At some point, we may be very attractive to be acquired, but that's to be seen. So where are we with the phase 3 study? And just to explain the profile of it, we're studying it in the United States, in Europe, and in Mauritius. And the reason it's in Mauritius is there is an unusually high incidence of lupus in the population. And I think that is very much the genetic makeup of the Mauritian population more than anything else. So we've got a number of centres across all of those territories. In total, there's 200 patients. So we have 100 patients on the active drug and 100 patients on the placebo. So our primary endpoint is to see responses And we then have to measure the responses of the active group against the placebo group, and we have to get in that hopefully positive differential what we call a statistical significant difference. So that's all very fancy statistics, and lots of sums are done by the statisticians. But as we saw in our phase 2 trial, we got statistical significance over placebo in that, and there's no reason to suggest that we won't get again in this study. The protocol is 1 year, so the patients go into their doctors once a month and they get this jab, subcutaneous jab, as I explained, in the top of the arm. All the patients, all 200 patients have now completed. We confirmed that in January, and we should expect the database to be locked at some point, which means that all the data has been collected from all the different centres, it's all been checked. That process is ongoing as we speak. So when everyone is happy, all the data is in and it's all been checked and it's all ready, the database is locked. So that means no more data can be input. It also means that we can then unblind it. So as of this point now, we do not know which patients have been taking the drug and which patients have been on active. So this is what we call a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, randomized trial. So it's no point asking me in the Q&A, do I know what the results are going to be? Because I don't. I have no clue whatsoever. We have some anecdotal evidence, and again, I'm not telling any stories out of school here, because just recently we announced that we were doing an extension study, and what that extension study means is that due to demand from both patients in the study and doctors in the study, they've asked us whether or not we will allow patients to carry on taking the drug once they finish the phase 3 trial. So we were delighted to say yes to that. We're going to obviously supply that drug free of charge, and it will be a 6-month study when we will collect a lot more data, and you can never get enough data in this business. And all patients that have been in the phase 3 study, whether they've been on placebo or active, will be eligible, and every single patient will get the drug. So there's no blinding, there's no randomization, it's completely open label study, as we call it. And that study we're just getting up and running at the moment. But the important thing in terms of trying to understand what that means, it means that somewhere somebody is getting some effect, because otherwise they wouldn't ask to be on the drug anymore. So that, I think, is very positive anecdotal evidence, but I do emphasize it is anecdotal, but it shows something is working for some of the patients in some of the territories. Oops. So I think I've covered this, but just so there's no mistake whatsoever, the guidance which we've been very consistent on is the top line results should be out by the end of this first quarter. So we're halfway through February already, which means halfway through the quarter, and we do expect them around the end of the quarter. So I'm not very good at driving this, am I? So the 6-month extension study, I think I've already covered as well, but if there are any further questions, then obviously in the Q&A. We're also asked about regulatory submissions, and our intention, once we get the results from this study, will be to put a file together for the FDA. This is an area of high unmet medical need. As I explained, the only other drug specifically prescribed for lupus is Benlysta, and I've described the differences between Lupus and Benlysta. Otherwise, patients are just taking what we call palliative treatment. So they're trying to treat the symptoms, whether it be a topical skin cream, for example, or pain relief, or relief for fever, which is one of the symptoms as well, which is really just treating the symptoms. It's not really getting to the cause. So if we can bring an innovative drug to the market, such as Lupusol, we believe that all patients will want it, all doctors will want to prescribe it, and with the completely benign side effect, why wouldn't you take it? It's a pretty obvious thing to say, but it's a pretty unique product profile we have here. So in terms of the regulatory submission, our belief is that with that product profile and with the support of the FDA that we've seen to date, we will prepare the file as quickly as we can. It does take a while to put a file together because there's an awful lot of data that goes into it. And then we will approach the FDA for approval based on the data we've received from this study and see whether we can get accelerated approval onto the market. The P140 platform, I'm not going to speak an awful lot about, but it's just to, as I mentioned earlier, it's just to emphasize the fact that because of the way that this is working on the immune system, if we can stop the immune system from this cascade that I described, which then in turn gives the autoantibodies that are being produced, if we stop it right at the top of the cascade, it doesn't differentiate between the disease. We happen to be trialing it in lupus in this particular study, but we could just as well have been trialing it in rheumatoid arthritis or one of the other autoimmune diseases. So we have a lot of evidence to suggest, and the inventor of this drug, Professor Sylvain Muller, who works at the CNRS, has an awful lot of work on the P140 platform and in other indications, which give us a lot of confidence that if we can crack this nut with lupus, then we have a really, really good chance of using the same drug, same method of administration, same dosage in lots of other indications, which would be great for those patient populations, but obviously from the commercial potential could be huge. I'm pleased to say that when we put these milestones out a couple of years ago, we've ticked the boxes on every single one as we came through, and we've just got the last one to tick, so fingers crossed. And I'm not going to go through the investment rationale, I'm sure you've all picked all that up.